In late antiquity, roughly 300 to about 600, maybe 700 depending on where and when you decide to end it and start the medieval period, the Roman Empire was split in half. One half, the eastern half, had its capital at Constantinople, constructed by the Emperor Constantine on the site of the port of Byzantium. The western half had its capital not at Rome, but at Milan, and then at Ravenna. So, why did Rome stop being the capital? After all, it was still a large city, probably the biggest in the Western Empire at the time, or at least close to it, and it had been the center of culture and politics for centuries by that time. The answer is more or less that the situation of the empire had changed, and that a capital close to the frontier was required to help oversee defense. Now, we should not necessarily look at this as a situation in which the empire is under siege by barbarians. Not because that view is wrong, but because on the one hand it doesn't actually capture the complexity of the situation, and on the other hand, because the capital was moved prior to that even being a serious problem. The way the Roman Empire worked in the 1st and 2nd centuries was through a decentralized patronage system. When the Romans conquered or otherwise incorporated a territory, assuming you weren't killed, if you were a member of the elite, odds are you would be brought into the fold, and you got to keep your previous position and prestige, but now you worked for the Romans. Other prominent Roman families would also move into the area. Together, you all served as local administrators. You collected taxes and you got to keep a cut of it. You took care of the population and you built a lot. And what did you build? Temples, bathhouses, aqueducts, etc. Essentially any public structure you could, because it was part of how the empire was tied together. As the 2nd century came to a close, though, a problem developed. The provinces became wealthier and they were able to manufacture their own stuff more easily, and the elites ran out of space. How many temples does a tiny village need, for example? Cities were large, but they were not on the scale of Tokyo or New York or Los Angeles, so how many bathhouses could you actually build? The changing system caused a crisis of imperial legitimacy. The bonds of loyalty were weakened, and to a very large degree, this was what the crisis of the 3rd century, if that's the term we want to use, some would call it the anarchy, some would question whether or not there was a crisis at all, was really about. There was a lot going on here. There was plague, there were barbarian raids, there was civil war, rebellion, serious inflation. 2 large portions of the Roman Empire appear to have broken away. So in the 3rd century, what you start to see is a policy of really active military rule. The emperor had always been a military commander, and had always been close to the army, but now it took on a different dimension. An area was really only defended if the army, and more importantly, if the emperor was present. So in 260, the Emperor Gallienus, experimenting with military reforms, built up units of cavalry which could be sent out wherever they were needed, whenever they were needed, and he created a standing field army which was designed to draw on a region's resources to a much greater degree than they had in previous decades or centuries. The whole point was to try and make this thing survive, and having long supply lines was not ideal for that purpose. Around that time, the general Postumus revolted, breaking Gaul and Britain away from the Roman Empire, and the Alemanni also threatened Italy. So Gallienus stationed his army at Milan, Mediolanum to the Romans, because it was near the Alps and thus in a good defensive position to defend northern Italy. When Diocletian came to power in 284, he made Milan one of the capitals after he split the empire into 4 broad administrative zones. It was near the frontier and it also had an imperial mint. The city of Rome, while remaining an important cultural center, had simply been eclipsed because the empire now had different priorities. So, that's Milan. Now what about Ravenna? Well, the capital of the Western Empire was moved from Milan to Ravenna during the period of what's called child rule. And by the way, there's a great book on this topic called Child Emperor Rule in the Late Roman West by Megan McAvoy. Ravenna has 2 major things going for it. Thing number 1, the city had marshes in front of it, so it was extremely difficult to besiege. And thing number 2, it was a port on the Adriatic and it held the imperial fleet. If something happened, the emperor could be quickly moved to Constantinople. So, what does that have to do with child emperors? Well, when Theodosius the Great died in 395, he left the eastern half of the empire to his son Arcadius and the western half to his other son Honorius, who was all of 10 years old at the time. And he had a protector, the general Stilicho. Stilicho has had all sorts of wild conspiracies and accusations directed against him, mainly alleging that he wanted to become emperor, but while he did marry into the imperial family, now historians are thinking he didn't really have any real reason to be disloyal and possibly viewed Honorius as a son. But Stilicho did make an effort to control Honorius because he was concerned about him, and by extension, about the safety of his own skin. So when Ulrich the Goth invades Italy in 401, Stilicho pulled everyone back to Ravenna, and there the capital stayed. Rome, of course, still had serious symbolic status, as evidenced by Ulrich's siege and capture, but there you have it. That's why the city of Rome stopped being the capital of the empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and why it moved twice, first to Milan and then to Ravenna.